All right, I'm Jo Beth. I'm a student registered nurse anesthetist studying to be a CRNA, and I'm going to talk about malignant hyperthermia. Yeah, I learn best through talking it out to myself and teaching it to myself, so I decided I'm going to record as I go, and that way I have things to look back on of me teaching myself here in a couple years when it's time to study for boards. I took this test about 2 weeks ago. I did review the information really quickly, so hopefully it's all there ready to access. And I'm going to see if we can run through this real quick and do quick down and dirty malignant hyperthermia. All right, so malignant hyperthermia, first thing we're going to think about is, what is it? Malignant hyperthermia is a genetic hypermetabolic syndrome. So genetic hypermetabolic syndrome. From the ryanodine receptor. It's not always from the ryanodine receptor, but that is going to be the most common one. So it's like a mutant ryanodine receptor. I'm not sure if that's an A or an O. I think it's an A. All right. So what happens when the body with a mutant ryanodine receptor is exposed to a triggering agent? We'll talk about those in just a second. But when it's exposed to a triggering agent, what happens in the sarcoplasmic reticulum is the calcium channels just open and it stays open, right? The ryanodine receptor is a calcium channel. So it opens, it stays open, it's stuck, it can't close. And so suddenly you get all this calcium that's been sequestered in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it all gets pounded into the intracellular space, right? So it's just pouring into that intracellular space, and we know that when that calcium comes out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum and pours into that intracellular space, it causes muscle contraction. So we're getting like a sustained muscle contraction. We're getting a tetany almost. So we get calcium release, and that leads to muscle contraction. And then the body's like, oh man, this isn't good, right? We need to try to stick that calcium back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum because we've got too much here. We've got a big imbalance. But the problem is, for it to go back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it has to go through an active transport phase. It goes through a calcium ATP pump. So it's trying to pour this calcium back in, but it can't keep up. I've heard it described as like trying to fill a bucket of water that has a hole in the bottom. You can't keep up. It's constantly pouring out. I really liked that description. So calcium's being released, we're getting muscle contraction, we're trying to put it back in, we're going through a calcium ATP pump, and it's just not able to keep up. So we're pouring through tons of ATP, right? So as we're pouring through tons of ATP, trying to put this calcium back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, what's happening is we're using up a lot of oxygen because we're using up all this ATP. So we need to start making more, right? We need to start some cell metabolism. So we're using up a bunch of oxygen. We're using up a ton of this ATP. And then because we're using all this oxygen, trying to make more ATP through aerobic metabolism, we're running out of oxygen. We're going to wind up with an anaerobic metabolism, and we're going to start creating lactic acid. So those quick three things. We are, let's see, running through lots of ATP, right? And we're running through lots of oxygen. We're winding up in an anaerobic state while we're still trying to make more ATP. So the byproduct of anaerobic metabolism is lactic acid. And that's all I want to start with for like the very basics, what's going to happen, and then we're going to dive into some patho. So yeah, genetic hypermetabolic syndrome. Mutant ryanodine receptor stays open when it's exposed to a triggering agent. It winds up with a ton of calcium released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum to the intracellular space. Wind up with sustained muscle contraction. Body's trying to put that calcium back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, but it can't keep up. It's got to keep making more ATP to do that. It's running through all its oxygen. So now we're in an anaerobic state of metabolism, and we're getting lactic acid. So all these things are going to lead to all our problems. So first, let's talk about our triggering agents. So your triggering agents are going to be your halogenated anesthetic agents, your inhalation agents. And there's like any of those can trigger this, but there's three main ones that are still used today, and then one neuromuscular blocking agent. So to remember these four triggering agents, I said DISS, D-I-S-S is the acronym I use. So D, desoflurane, right? So we got D-I-S-S, desoflurane. I is isoflurane. S is sevoflurane. And then our neuromuscular blocking agent is SUX, succinylcholine. My handwriting is terrible on this dry erase board right now. All right, so these are our triggering agents. Who do we need to worry about winding up with malignant hyperthermia? Now, remembering that like up to 50% of patients who develop a malignant hyperthermia emergency have had a previous surgical experience with a triggering agent without having any type of emergency. So just because you run through the questions and they say, oh yeah, I'm good, doesn't mean that, doesn't mean you're in the clear, right? So still being cautious. But the people you're really looking out for, first, just general, we have young males, young male. Genetics, if they have a family history of malignant hyperthermia, they're gonna know and they're gonna tell you, right? So that's in theory, right? So young men, genetic predisposition. There's a couple other random ones and then the definite diseases. So history of exercise-induced rhabdo, and then history of heat stroke. I thought that was interesting. And then the disease processes that are not debated, right? These are definitely associated with malignant hyperthermia. I was remembering these with the acronym McKing. I said, hey, McDonald's made a new sandwich and they're calling it the McKing, the MC King. So we got MC King. M is let's get to see my dogs. Multi-mini core myopathy. C is central core disease, and King is King-Denborough syndrome. And then there's a few others that are still debated as to if they're definitely affiliated, but my understanding is to be extremely cautious and probably treat them as if they are. And so there you get some non-specific myopathies. You get your muscular dystrophy and your osteogenesis imperfecta. And then geography. Wisconsin, Michigan, and West Virginia. All right. Early signs, what are the first things we're probably going to see? So your early signs, think about what's happening early here, right? I mean, we think malignant hyperthermia, and right off the bat, you think that you're going to see their temperature skyrocketing through the roof, and that's not necessarily the case. So number one, first sign you're probably going to see, because, you know, you've just induced, and you know, we just got them all hooked up. So we're going to have them hooked up to end tidal, and that's one of the first things you're going to see, right? Because we're starting to burn through this oxygen. So we're starting to create a lot of CO2. We'll get to all patho in a second. So early signs, we have rising end tidal CO2, right? We have tachycardia. Those are the two big ones that you're most likely going to see really early, but there's one big sign. It's the, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. I've heard it pronounced masseter, and I've heard it pronounced masseter. I've always said masseter, masseter muscle, but masseter muscle rigidity, right? So masseter muscle rigidity right there. So these are your real early signs. All right. Let's get into patho. Okay. So, looking back over here, we said end tidal CO2 is one of our first signs, so let's talk about that. we've got, we're burning through oxygen, right? Because we're trying to create all this extra energy. We're burning through oxygen with that cell metabolism. So we've got a high O2 use, and that's going to lead to increased CO2, and you'll see that as increased end-tidal CO2, and if you're doing that ABG, you're going to see it as the increased PaCO2. So what are we going to do for that? We're going to hyperventilate. Try to help the patient blow off some of that CO2. Try to help them out with that process. And remember that what this is going to cause, right, as this CO2 is going to go up, is respiratory acidosis. We're just going to leave that like that. Okay, so burning through some oxygen, we're creating a lot of CO2. We see that on the end tidal, we see that on the PaCO2. It's leading to a respiratory acidosis, and we're going to hyperventilate them to help them out with that. We're burning through lots of ATP. We're trying to create more, but we're in an anaerobic state. So we're getting a lot of byproduct of lactic acid, right? So we're anaerobic. It's leading to lactic acid production. Which is leading to metabolic acidosis with an anion gap. And for that, this is a temporizing measure. This isn't fixing the whole problem, but I mean, if they're getting so acidotic that pH is dropping down to 7.1, 7.0, 6.9, we need to do something about that. So we're gonna give sodium bicarb, right? I'm just gonna put it there as this, but what's this? But remembering remembering that when we combine bicarb with the hydrogen ions, right, all these free hydrogen ions that we're getting with this acidosis, we're going to go on ultimately to wind up with water and CO2 as our byproduct. Now, we're already struggling with all this CO2, right? However, we've got to do something to fix this acidosis in the interim. It is just a temporizing measure. It's not the ultimate solution. It's just going to help things for a little while we get everything else under control. So not forgetting that we're going to be releasing all the CO2 whenever we do give that bicarb. So like being cautious with that, right? I'm just gonna leave that. All right, so we've gone through our oxygen, our CO2, our anaerobic state. So when all this starts happening, it's really, I do want that out of the way. All right, when all this starts happening, it's gonna trigger sympathetic response, right? So we're triggering the, so I'm just going to call it the SMS, or the SNS. We're triggering the sympathetic nervous system stimulation. All right, sympathetic nervous system gets stimulated, and that's going to lead to increased heart rate, right? We're going to see that tachycardia. Early on, you might see hypertension because of that sympathetic nervous system stimulation. So might see that elevated BP. Of course, it's going to drop after a little while, right? But right off the bat, you might see an elevated BP. So increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, and we might see some arrhythmias, especially these tachyarrhythmias. So you might start to see AFib with RVR. You might see VTAC with a pulse. Later on down the line, you might see VTAC, VFib as the patient arrests. So increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, we're going to get some tachyarrhythmias. So what are we going to do about those? We want to treat these tachyarrhythmias, right? So RX for rhythm, whatever it is that you need to give at that time, without giving calcium channel blockers. Before I talk about that though, so we're going to treat for that rhythm. And you might, I know this is a calcium issue, so this really goes against everything you think, but you can give calcium chloride as a cardiotonic. However, no calcium channel blockers. And this really threw me for a second because I was like, all right, ranitidine's a calcium channel. It's stuck open. It's releasing all this calcium. Why wouldn't you want to give calcium channel blockers? You're going to block it off, and then we can, put the calcium back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and fix the problem. However, this has an interaction with dantrolene. Dantrolene is the only FDA approved medication to treat malignant hyperthermia, and you give calcium channel blockers along with dantrolene, and you get profound hyperkalemia, and then you won't have a patient to treat. So I got all that. I did make a couple notes here real quick, so I would be organized. All right, so I have another one that's a little, we're just gonna go to this. So, and that calcium releases and we're getting that sustained muscle contraction, right? So we got muscle contraction, and it's gonna lead to breakdown. And that, my handwriting's never been so bad. And that is going to lead to, those muscles are going to start releasing myoglobin, right? We know that myoglobin's bigger than hemoglobin. It's going to get to those kidneys and it's going to have a really hard time processing that through, right? So we're going to have high myoglobin. We're going to have high CK. It's all going to lead to rhabdomyolysis and acute kidney injury. So we want to try to prevent that. So we're going to give fluids. We're going to give isotonic fluids. And we're going to give a good bit. We're not dumping in liters on liters, but we're going to give about 2 ml per kilo an hour, or more than, right? To try to rein that in. Okay. Now, all right, we got a lot of things going on here. We're getting electrolyte shifts. We've got the CO2 going up. We've got the pH going down, and we've got muscle breakdown. And all these things are going to contribute to hyperkalemia. So, CO2, pH, I'm just going to put those two. And we're going to wind up with hyperkalemia. And that, of course, isn't helping the tachyarrhythmias at all, right? It's all super cardiotoxic. So we got this hyperkalemia and we need to go ahead and treat it. So we're going to give insulin, right? We're going to push the potassium back into the cells. We're going to give a dextrose, right? Because we don't want our patient to get hypoglycemic. And then we're going to give diuretics, try to help the body push that potassium out through the kidneys. However, diuretics we're going to think about Lasix. Bumex wasn't one I was familiar with, so I've had to become familiar with that a little bit. What we're definitely not going to give, no, mannitol. And we're not going to give mannitol because, again, it's an interaction with the dantrolene. Not so much an interaction, but the dantrolene already has mannitol in it, and it has a good bit, actually. So we want to avoid giving mannitol because they're already experiencing some of that hypotonic solution through the mannitol there. So we don't want to go giving them too much. All right, let's see. Oh. Hyperthermia, right? So pouring through all this ATP, trying to create more, it's all creating heat, right? So heat production, and we're getting hyperthermia. And this can happen really fast. I think on my test, it was go up by 1 degree Celsius every 5 minutes. And what I was reading in some of the other podcasts I listened to, it sounded like 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. every 5 minutes. It can happen really, really quickly. So when do we want to treat this? Want to treat this when the temperature is going over 39 degrees Celsius, right? So if we're above 39 degrees Celsius, we're going to go ahead and treat. We're going to do that with lavage, cool fluids, right? We can lavage the bladder, we can lavage the stomach, we can give cool fluids intravenously. We can do ice over the skin transcutaneously. We can do that over like arterial sites. So think the axilla, the groin, even over the trunk. And you can pack ice in open body cavities. I mean, if they're in surgery and they've, are in the middle of it, if it's possible, they could pack ice in an open body cavity, and then like cooling blankets. And then you want to stop treating that if we're starting to drop below 38 degrees Celsius and falling, because we don't want them to be hyperthermic, but we don't want them to get hypothermic. So don't overtreat. Okay. Dantrolene. All right, dantrolene. Two different formularies. The older formulary is going to be, oh, I forgot. I'll remember later. However, the older formulary, couple things to know. The older formulary, you're going to have to mix up in like 60 mLs per, I think it's 20 milligrams. And it takes a really long time to mix up because it's not, it just doesn't mix with water very well. The other big thing to remember is that older formulary, well, it's cheaper, and it's what my hospital had that I worked at most recently, has a much higher mannitol content. We're talking 3 grams of mannitol per 20 milligrams of dantrolene, and you're giving a lot of dantrolene. So the newer one, you mix up in a much smaller amount of fluid, and it's more water soluble. So it's a lot easier and quicker to mix, which is so important when you think about, all right, so the loading dose is 2.5 milligrams per kilogram IV push. So 2.5 milligrams per kilogram, and that's IV. And you're gonna go ahead and give this as quickly as you can, right? But I mean, we're talking pretty solid doses here, especially if you're having to do 60 mLs per 20 milligrams. I mean, big doses. And you're gonna repeat this. Like every 5 to 10 minutes, you're gonna repeat this until the symptoms start to go away. Up to, so in class in our lecture, it was kind of given that it was, your max dose was 10 milligrams per kilogram. So like repeating this, a total of 4 times. But then other things I've read and in some podcasts I've listened to with some anesthesiologists and some other CRNAs, it sounded more like you kind of just keep giving it, but you're starting to get up to that 10 milligrams per kilogram. Like you've given this first dose, you've given 3 more, and you're still not seeing any improvement in those signs and symptoms. And you want to start going, is this actually malignant hyperthermia, or do we have something different that's mimicking it at this point? So I'm not really clear on if 10 milligrams per kilogram is a max dose per se, or if it's more like a, hey, this isn't working. Maybe that's not what this is kind of situation. All right, so dantrolene, 2.5 milligrams per kilogram IV push, and you're going to do that until the symptoms start to get better. And then it's going to get repeated, and it's going to repeat at 1 milligram per kilogram, and that's going to be every 6 hours for 24 to 48 hours. And that's because it can recur. I want to go back and talk about that MMR. Yeah, let's talk about that real fast. Just as a side note, that masseter muscle rigidity, remember that only like, oh my gosh, how many was it? I want to say it's like only 50% of the patients will have this masseter muscle rigidity. And this is not to be confused for, you've given your neuromuscular blocking agent, right? Let's say you've gone ahead and given your sucks, and it's been enough time and you feel like the patient should have enough paralysis on board, but you've got this kind of like tension and it's not enough medication. Not to be confused with that, right? Like with underdosing. This is, you know, really rigid. You couldn't pry that jaw open if you wanted to. Not everybody has that. It's a major symptom. And if you do see that, it's malignant hyperthermia until proven otherwise. But, I mean, you can't count on that being there, right? You can't count on it. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about differential diagnoses. So, one of my classmates came up with this mnemonic. So for our differentials, we've got THC, SMS, PM. And this helped because this C right here, we're thinking cocaine. So he's like, THC, think drugs. So cocaine or other drugs, right, that might really stimulate that sympathetic nervous system. You might get a thyroid storm. I'm gonna see if I can remember that one in a second. All right, S, we got serotonin syndrome. Malignant neuroleptic syndrome. Sepsis. This is pheochromocytoma. And then we have metastatic carcinoid tumor, and that's going to affect the adrenal glands. Oh, why can't I remember this? All right, thyroid storm. Is it heat stroke? It is heat stroke. It's not even complicated. Heat stroke. See, it's been 2 weeks. Obviously, I need to review this. All right. Okay, so